Recording. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another psychedelic safety seminar. I'm Jules Evans. I'm the founder of the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project. So one of the things that fascinates me about covering psychedelics and the psychedelic renaissance is just exploring how psychedelics interact with different cultural contexts. For example, in Utah, it's the home base of the Mormon or the LDS church. The population there, I understand, is something like 60 to 70% LDS. And yet it seems to be that psychedelics appear to be pretty popular in Utah, um, both among former members of LDS and also with existing members of LDS. So there are psychedelic churches like the Divine Assembly.
Hi,
There,
Ollie.
there is psychedelic legislation, which I believe is hopefully going to be passed possibly tomorrow to do a trial of 5-MeO DMT with veterans. There was even there's this reality show, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, where several members of that TV show did ketamine therapy. So we're going to discuss some of these topics today, and we've got a fantastic panel. We have Miriam Kayo, who is a psychedelic researcher and has also been involved in HB
Hey, Ollie.
390. I'm just going to, can I ask people to mute themselves? I think pretty much, okay, I'm going to mute all. There we go. So you're gonna have to demute yourselves, the speakers. She's also been involved with HB 390, the psychedelic legislation, hopefully being passed this week. We have Doug Whitman, who is the host of the podcast Mormons on Mushrooms. We have Rich White, who's an entrepreneur who's been both helped by psychedelics, but also had a negative experience with a megalomaniac psychedelic life coach. And we have Stephanie Brinkerhoff, a famous hairstylist, hundreds of thousands of followers on social media, who tried mushrooms and subsequently left LDS. And all the panel actually grew up in the LDS church. Um, okay, well, thanks for joining us, everybody. The format we're going to do is I'm going to ask you some questions for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll see if anyone has questions in the audience. If you have questions along the way, audience, you can just put them in the chat as well. So first of all, can you give us an idea, panel, of what is the Mormon Church's attitude to psychedelics or to drugs in general? Maybe Doug, as the host of Mormons or Mushrooms, you could start us off on that. So what's LDS attitude to psychedelics and drugs in general?
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Jules, for hosting this event. Thanks for inviting us on to talk about this. The church's the church's stance on what they would call illicit drugs and substances is they take a very hard line no on it. Famously, the church has a doctrine called the Word of Wisdom, and within the word of wisdom, it encourages the consumption of certain things, and it also prohibits the consumption of other things. And famously, Mormons don't drink coffee or tea or alcohol or smoke tobacco, and then part of that is the use of illicit uh, drugs and abuse of those types of substances. So the church traditionally does not allow for those. There's like a lot of, the cool thing about Mormonism is that it's ever changing, and there's a lot of nuance that comes with it, with a lot of the members. And so
Mm.
my answer is probably as close to technically uh, the church's stance, but I know that there's a lot of members of the church that live in that a la carte sort of like nuanced space that I think the church sort of allows for.
It's also the case, I guess, that Mormonism seems to be quite open to ecstatic experiences. In the 19th century, when there was less openness to it, they were, talking about, hey, miracles still happen, ecstatic healing, speaking in tongues, and so on. It seems to be the kind of US capital of UFO culture. So entity encounter seems to be a thing. So in some ways, there seems to be some kind of implicit or hidden cultural sympathy between Mormons and psychedelics. Does any panel members, Miriam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something part of the Mormon culture where, they have like this pioneer spirit where they're hungry for spiritual connection and being able to feel like divinity. And I think that that openness really lends itself well to um, things that are not necessarily very explainable. I mean, even just the story of how the church was founded with Joseph Smith finding plates. And I mean, there's a lot that is isn't necessarily in like the mainstream as far as what's normal. And I think that the LDS faith really is more open, I would say, than other faiths to these types of experiences.
Stephanie and Rich, do you have anything to add on that in terms of the official stance of the church and maybe any kind of implicit cultural sympathy with psychedelic and ecstatic experiences?
I mean, I'd say that culturally it's very entrepreneurial. If you're willing to, my great great grandpa sailed on a boat and worked as a cook with a bunch of young kids and walked with the pioneers here to Utah to settle it. And for you to put up all the persecution that was going on at the time for what you believe in, that takes a lot of courage. And that's the kind of, I feel like, mentality that's here. And the challenge with evolution, despite that, is when you start collapsing, structure around it, like any bureaucracy, it gets laden and then it has a hard time evolving. And while I feel like the entrepreneurial, the expansive, higher truth seeking spirit's still there, there's definitely some hindrance to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's even like some theories that Joseph Smith himself did mushrooms, like he had seer stones and he was like a very mystical person. And in Mormonism, there's a lot of talk of personal revelation. It's like a big thing in the Mormon church. There's like conflicting messages because they'll tell you, personal revelation is huge. Everyone can talk to God for themselves, but then they'll also tell you, you got to follow these rules, you got to follow the prophet, whatever. But I think amongst the members, there is that kind of more mystical sort of, yeah, like I can have my own personal relationship with the divine kind of like built into the culture.
Mm. So, to what extent are practicing Mormons in the church trying psychedelics? Um, Doug, maybe start with you, and I'd love to hear from all the panel.
Yeah, can I just add to the last
Yeah.
question because I have that's my favorite part of
Mm,
my Mormon heritage because the 19th century Mormonism is chock full of the supernatural, the occult, ecstatic experiences. The, uh, Joseph Smith is seeing angels and is being visited by other entities to restore the church. Meanwhile, there's a lot of baked in mythology within like the origins of Mormonism, things like aliens, things like Bigfoot, like leaders of the church having interactions, having interactions with a Sasquatch.
mm,
And Mormonism sort of took a facelift, two facelifts really, in the Depression era America. I mean, Mormonism is really reflective of like sort of that Wild West manifest destiny Americana. And
mm,
then, through Prohibition, the Mormon Church kind of took a hard right into sort of like being a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more like traditional, Catholicism-based Christianity. But and then again, they took, post World War II, kind of in the 1950s IBM business world, Mormonism kind of took that direction. But the Mormonism that I love is the origins of the church, which is very much steeped in the supernatural and mythology and the occult
mm.
and ecstatic experiences. So I'm sorry that I
Yeah.
didn't answer but yes, as
No, no,
far as
sure. And
like
I just read a biography of Joseph Smith, and it felt like an episode of Wild Wild Country.
yeah, yes, yeah, exactly. It's like
Yeah,
Wild Wild Country if it took place like
100 years earlier.
yeah, right before the American Civil War and right before
Yeah.
like the sort of like expansion into the Wild West stories and
Mm.
I mean, Mormonism is like a offshoot of Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill and that kind of cool stuff.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can I just to follow up on this, talking about the cultural sympathy, there is that openness to ecstatic experiences, but there's also, it was partly created to explain the presence of Native Americans, and the explanation that Joseph Smith came up with was Native Americans were this, Israeli offshoot that were there was the kind of they were the kind of inferior. They would ultimately be redeemed and they'd become white. But it's a long way from modern day veneration of indigenous cultures, isn't it? Right. And I'm curious, compared to, like, say, New Mexico, which has recently passed psychedelic legislation, and there's much more of a kind of, built-in reverence and respect for indigenous culture in New Mexico with the legislate, is that an issue? Is that, in terms of LDS attitude to like mushrooms, that you is there still a bit of a deprecation of indigenous culture, or is that long gone and that was 150 years ago?
I can chime in. Are you referring to like the culture itself or like the leadership?
Well, I'm just curious about, back in the day in the 1850s, there did seem to be this, there was a racism to Mormon theology. Is that still around? And do you think that might shape the church's attitude to plant medicine, or am I way off?
I mean, my own personal opinion, as far as the leadership goes, I would say yes. I mean, I can't speak for the culture, like the members, because I think
Mm.
everybody's a little bit different. But I feel like, at least my opinion of Mormonism in general is yeah, I feel like that racism is still there for sure in the leadership.
Well, let's get on to what's going on now. And tell me, are Mormons quietly trying psychedelics, experimenting with psychedelics? What's going on within the LDS Church? Miriam, you have any insights?
Absolutely, yeah. It's pretty fascinating to me. My own journey, it was something that I felt like when I started using psilocybin, that it was very quiet because I didn't want anyone else to know because they are illegal. It was against the word of wisdom. There's a stigma attached there, but it was one of the most like spiritual experiences of my life, and it was so profound that I didn't want to stop, and so I continued my journey. I know a lot of people that are LDS that have done very similar things where they're quietly doing this. They don't want to, talk to their bishop about it or talk to anyone in their family or their friends, but that this is something that they've tapped into and it is absolutely meaningful to their spiritual connection, and that there's the attention that happens when they know that they're not following the authoritarian rule of what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do, but they're also feeling, or at least I was feeling like, but this is the most connected I've ever felt to the divine. So anyway, it lends itself to some really tricky tensions.
Mm. Because in some ways it sounds like it can be, sorry, Rich, a kind of refreshing your spirituality, but also
Mhm.
creating a bit of a dissonance with your religious culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Rich.
I wanted to mention, Jules, that rituals are by design to alter your state. That's why they've always existed. That's why religions are formed, and that's generally the intent, at least early on, is you're to arrive to this higher state, this higher experience, and be able to process maybe the complete suffering that was the previous week or whatever. And I feel like one of the downsides is every time an institution gets formed, or every time a truth teller comes and starts talking about the truth, they usually, a prophet or someone, they usually get thrown in jail or killed, and then they form a religion around them, and then they need to have hierarchy to manage that structure. And the bigger it gets, it starts enforcing then like, hey, you're supposed to do things this way, and people eventually they get disconnected from the entire you know purpose that it was at the beginning, and they find themselves like a Pharisee performing dogmatic operations but not really feeling spiritually connected. So given the opportunity to have this altered state experience that you can get altered states through playing with your kids, a bunch of different things, but the psychedelic one's so I don't lack of a better word, violent. It's so just so incredible. You think, wow, my whole world just got disassembled. And I feel like, I know a really prominent businessman here in Utah, and his daughter was suicidal, and she got ketamine treatments, and it saved her life. And so he turned around and started opening up ketamine clinics to serve, and that was a very high up in the church authority guy, really revered businessman. So it's becoming very popular. And the last thing I would say is that initially you're talking about you lump psychedelics into drugs. What's the difference between a drug and a medicine?
Mm,
It's how it's used, right? So I think it's helping a ton of people get connected, like Miriam said, for the first time maybe in a long, long time, to a deep spiritual experience, and
mm.
it's proven very powerful.
Yeah, Doug and Stephanie, what have you seen happening within LDS? Are there people taking psychedelics and staying in the church?
Steph?
Yeah, I have seen that. I mean, I think it can go one of two ways. It's either you're experimenting with psychedelics and you're connecting to something and you're kind of like, yeah, you're in that gray area of like, okay, I feel like I'm connecting to something really important and powerful, but this doesn't align with what the church is saying. And then I've also seen people who will have experiences with Joseph Smith on their journeys, and they come out of their psychedelic experience and they're like, I know this church is true, and they're almost like further cemented in their belief system. So I think it kind of depends on, and this is kind of an area where I feel like it can be a little risky for uh, the Mormon culture sometimes because there is a little bit of developmental stunting and trauma in Mormonism. And if you jump into something like psychedelics, there's a lot of like just maturing that still needs to happen. And I'm speaking from personal experience too, like jumping in way too quickly and then realizing like, oh, there's a lot of things I need to understand about myself and a lot of ways I still need to develop in order to be able to handle an experience like this and not have it turn into ego inflation or into something that's actually counterproductive.
Mm. Doug, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just to add to what Stephanie's talking about. I do know quite a few current active what they would consider faithful members of the church who actively participate with things like psychedelics. From what I've experienced or kind of noticed, there people fall somewhere. I mean, everyone's belief is like a little bit different than everybody else's, but people sort of fall on this spectrum of sort of like literalism, like how literally they think all of the stories of the church tells. Like, did those things literally happen? I was a person who was very, very invested in the church and the concept of all of the stories the church tells are very literal. And then, when you have some of these, profound psychedelic experiences, and, Miriam talked about how it's a deeply spiritual experience. Suddenly that literalism is challenged and it kind of falls away. On the other side, there are people who consider a lot of the church's stories just allegorical and really good stories that help people live better lives. And and people that feel that way have an easier time sort of marrying those two concepts, or still actively participating with their faith, and
Mm,
then also diving into things like ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, that type of a thing, ayahuasca.
mm,
So I think it depends on that person's how they were raised, how their belief is sort of like settles home for them,
mm-hmm.
is a big part of it. A lot of times people think they can do it and then they slowly leave the church because they're like, hold on a second. Some of these things aren't adding up.
Yeah. So, Stephanie, you tried mushrooms and then left the church, and it sounds like, for you it was like a kind of wake up moment, and you saw your context, your social matrix, and the church in quite a different way. And it was both liberating, but it sounds like it's also somewhat destabilizing for you as well. It's obviously everyone's story is complicated. Could you give us a little bit of that about what happened for you?
Yeah, so I had been on an antidepressant for like 7 years. I wanted to get off of it because I wasn't liking the side effects. I had tried several different kinds. I was kind of getting to a point of feeling a little bit desperate. I'd been listening to podcasts about psychedelics and how they're good for rewiring your neural pathways and PTSD and all this stuff. And so I approached it from a purely like clinical perspective. And I even asked my bishop for permission at the time. I was like, this is, something that I really want to try. And I had an experience with mushrooms, and the experience itself was pretty mild. Nothing crazy happened. But then almost immediately afterwards, I was kind of like looking at the culture. I remember right around that time it was General Conference, which is the conference that the church broadcasts twice a year. And I remember listening to the prophet, and like everything that he was saying was seen in a completely different context, where I could see, I feel like I was just really sensitive to the undertones of control and the undertones of fear. And, it was kind of like everybody was smiling and really like fluffy and like, speaking in their kind, soft voices. But then I was like feeling the undertones of what they were saying in a way that I never had before. And then it very quickly unraveled from there. And I think, my experience with mushrooms kind of showed me that everything that the church was adding on to this experience, like this spirituality, this connection with something bigger than me, was extra and like unnecessary. And it was actually like taking away from my experience and taking away, like it wasn't even needed. And it was actually harmful to me. So
Mm,
it was kind of a very sudden paradigm shift for sure. It was
mm.
quite destabilizing.
Right, right, right. And it seems like there are quite a few people who've gone through a similar kind of journey, that maybe they've taken psychedelics and then decided to leave the church, or maybe they've left the church and then they've gone into a kind of intense phase of experimentation with psychedelics, maybe sometimes like polyamory and different things, everything that's forbidden by the church. That someone sent me a joke that a stand-up comedian did, saying everyone who's left Mormonism, you don't have to do psychedelics when you leave Mormonism because it seems so common. Is that right, Miriam? Is it quite common for people, to leave the church and then get quite into psychedelics for a bit?
Well, I feel what happens is that it's kind of like you have this pressurized hose that has had so much restriction and repression, and when you dekink it, and it's just like this blast of wanting to have experience and freedom and to really break away from this hierarchical way of living where someone's telling you how to show up, someone's telling you, what to believe, someone's telling you what to dress, what to drink, what to do. And so all of a sudden there's like this exciting sense of freedom. And I don't know how common it is that people jump right into polyamory or psychedelics, but I know that after hearing for so many years that you're bad or wrong or whatever for doing this, and then you get an opportunity to explore it, like there's a lot of hunger and curiosity. And I think that it eventually balances out, right? After that initial explosion. I think that that there's, oh, okay, all right. Now people kind of find their path, but it's not, I would say, easy to go carefully through the process of being like so restricted than to having freedom. I think it can be tumultuous and messy
Mm,
and liberating all at once.
yeah, right. Any other of the panel want to add on this? The
I think, like she said, the
mm,
first feeling of freedom, and it's just like when a teenager gets their hands on alcohol, something they weren't supposed to touch, and you break the levee, and they get alcohol poisoning because they overdo it. And so I don't even like. I'm trying to be really careful not to ever, blame necessarily a church for this kind of stuff. By and large, and I really love all the positive that happens in the Mormon church, but just the inherent nature is that our own fear, like Miriam was saying, or Stephanie was saying, that when we fear something, that creates a lot of negative emotion, and to get reprieve from those fears, and it might have been something of being judged by somebody for your worthiness, or it just happens to be in religions that a lot of times people feel compelled by fear rather than love. And like, I really don't like the expression the fear of God. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Fear is not a quality of God. And And but that's a lot of people's experience inside of religion. So at liberation of that, then the hard thing is this kind of faith crisis is, okay, now I'm feeling like I can do whatever I want. What do I actually want to do? And it's almost like the first time in their life that they're making their, authentic decisions for themselves rather than trying to comply to like someone else's program. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Any one else want to add, Doug or Stephanie?
I would just add, I think that the Rich and Miriam have really covered it, but you know, religion in general sort of like becomes a really foundational part of one's identity, and the higher demand religions, the more I guess steeped in identity that religious belief or that faith is. And so for me, that was my whole identity. Like number one was that I was Mormon. And when that was no longer true, I had to sort of at 31 years old start putting together the pieces of, okay, well then who am I? Like what do I believe? What is my value system? What are my ethics? What are my morals? What do I believe in? What don't I believe in? What am I willing to do? I mean, I adhered to the word of wisdom for like 3 years after officially leaving the church because I was so, to Rich's point, I was still kind of afraid of God. Like I was still in that sense of, well, I may have left believing the church, but adhering to its tenets got me to where I was, so I'm going to keep doing that. So
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's a strange experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, I remember during the time when I was first leaving, I kept having dreams about going into different stores and trying on different clothes, like repeatedly. And it feels very similar to what Doug was saying, where you're kind of like, I have no idea who I am or what I want or what I like, and so I'm just going to do all the things. And in a lot of ways, it really did for me feel like I was living my adolescent and my 20 years in my 30s. And so it can be kind of messy, like Miriam was saying, and it can be kind of like it's not this nice process, especially as like grown adults. It's like, okay, let me just relive my adolescence right now and figure out who I am right now. But it very much was a big part of the process for me, like going through all of that.
Can I ask a controversial question? So, like, I'm interested uh in cults. And there's what I realize is there's a whole academic debate over whether there's even such a thing as a cult. There's no agreement. There are people who think cults and brainwashing is just an invention by mainstream religion to put new religious movements down. And they actually point to Mormonism and anti-Mormon rhetoric in the 19th century, where people said, "Oh, they use mesmerism, they brainwash people, they're a criminal organization. We should crush them." Um, there's this whole debate ongoing to this day, and around psychedelic churches as well. That people are saying there's no such thing as a cult, and someone's like, oh, it's they're all cults or whatever. So I am curious whether former members of LDS, to what extent do they ever think, or is that a discussion? Oh, it was I was in a cult. Or no, it's not it, So I'm just it's a controversial question. I don't want to cause any offense, but to what extent do former members of LDS sometimes use the C word when talking about it?
I use it.
Yeah,
I think it's a cult. I mean, I guess I guess word definitions matter
of
to
course.
some
Yeah,
degree, right? If we're going to use them.
yeah,
And so, like, as far as the academic debate about what is and what isn't a cult, I mean, Mormonism ticks every box as far as like what is a cult. So I definitely use that word as Mormonism being a cult. Um, but I also consider myself a fan of the Grateful Dead, and I might be a Deadhead, and so I might be part of that cult. Now, I mean, I guess it just kind of depends on how a person wants to define that word.
yeah. Any other thoughts?
I can chime in. Yeah, I mean, I remember reading the book Cultish right after I left Mormonism, and she talks all about like the language and that like, a cult is a spectrum and it can be, a very unethical high control cult all the way to like being a Swiftie, where it's like it's everything in between. And it was very interesting because it was like she talked all about just how it's the way that language is used to essentially manipulate and control and convince you of certain things and provoke certain emotional states. And then when you add in like ritual, which is happening, obviously in Mormonism and then also in certain psychedelic churches and stuff like that, it can become even more convoluted. And, so yeah, I mean, I feel like, especially when you look at like the how destabilizing the process is of leaving.
Mm,
That's one thing that, Mormons will always say, like, you can leave whenever you want. Like, it's not a cult and we're not forcing anyone to stay, but like to fully psychologically leave and to really deconstruct for most people, it's like I would say over 10-year process because it's so ingrained in like the deep corners, darkest corners of your subconscious.
right. I guess partly because it's so dominant in the state. So this is an all immersive. And most people they have a church, but that's just one bit of the water they move in. But if everyone's a member of the same, church, that's just very immersive, I guess. You know what I mean? Then if you live in London and you go to a mosque or a church, it's just one bit of your life. Um, But is it, I mean, sorry to get on this, but is it very high control, to be a Mormon? Would you say it's a kind of high control group? Because, watching Secret Lives of Mormons doesn't seem that high control. So I'm curious, can you, sorry to go off on that. I'm just curious, as you can tell, but would you say it's a high control group, LDS? Yes,
It,
Miriam?
I
Yeah.
no,
Oh,
I just make one. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Marion.
Yeah,
Go
go
on.
on.
go. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yes, I would say that that the Mormon church or LDS church is definitely a cult. To Stephanie's point, like to get out is to lose your community, is to lose the practice, the traditions, the rituals, and they are embedded in prayer before every meal, in almost all aspects of the human condition. This faith is woven into someone's life, and so to disentangle yourself from it and to feel the ostracization. I mean, like if you get out of the church, your family will look poorly on you. You are no longer going to be living as an eternal family. You're breaking covenants, you're breaking rules. You're now going to probably not go to heaven. You won't live with God again. I mean, there are such big things that happen when you are not inside of the container of the church. And so in that alone, I would say that that would be very it demonstrates how much of a cult it is. Um, and then I'll let Rich answer the next question. You just asked something, so.
Yeah,
Oh no,
thank
I
you.
was just going to comment the fear thing. Another fear thing. That fear taints everybody's experience with God, and that's why and it comes from church leaders too. At times, that's the look at the Old Testament. Almost every book in there is makes God out to be this psychotic, awful being, and there's other scriptures too where start out really well. I know the Quran turned from like the sword of truth into the sword of steel. And it just happens to be that, there's imperfect people, there's fallen people trying to lead, spiritual matters. And there's always going to be a temptation to leverage fear as a control mechanism because that's the shadow that nobody really wants to talk about is that our deepest temptation is power and control over other people. That's what Jesus was tempted with, the Buddha was tempted with it, everyone that's said, every evolved spiritual being confronted with that. And I feel like a lot of times the church, is, even if it's not the gospel teachings, that the fallen person that might be conveying them puts their own layer of fear and maybe tries to scare their kids in their Sunday school class, saying, "If you guys drink alcohol, you're going to hell," or if you mess up, you're never going to be with your family for eternity. And that's not even like the gospel doctrine. It's just sort of like the nature of a religious setting when you have
Right.
people kind of projecting their own, fear on God and the teachings.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Wesley, I mean, usually I leave questions or comments till the end, but we're a kind of nice intimate group, so why not? And I know you've got a lot to offer this conversation as well. Is it a question or a comment, Wesley? You're muted at the moment. Wait a sec. Got to unmute yourself.
It was more just to riff off of what Miriam said. What's interesting is it's so hard to explain this to people who didn't grow up in the Mormon church. It's weird. So I have friends who they were completely ostracized by their family when they left the church. And then I've got other friends who came from really interesting Mormon families where there was a lot of love, a lot of support, and the parents were and the siblings were actually okay with them leaving the church. There wasn't any kind of a disruption in the family order, but it was still, I would say, in many ways, just as hard for them to leave the church.
Mm,
There's something about that community, there's something about the sense of belonging and purpose that even when you don't have the threat of your parents ostracizing you, it's still, I look back on it now and I can only kind of intellectually remember how difficult it was because I can't conjure up that emotional feeling or that sensation of being
mm.
torn apart from something that was so fundamental to your identity and rejecting that identity and then moving on, even in environments where there wasn't a lot of repression and a lot of sorry, I'm making motions here and it's triggering, where there wasn't a lot of guilt or repression coming from your family. It's just the way the because it's a lay clergy, we don't have professional clergy in our church, and so everyone participates very actively. You don't have, what do they call them? Submarine Catholics. They surface at Christmas and Easter. You don't have that in the Mormon church. You're either all in or you're all out. And when you're all in, it just envelops you and creates an identity that is extremely hard to walk away from.
Thank you. Yeah, and it sounds also, I guess, a bit like maybe leaving the military or a professional sports team. There's probably a dopamine crash of just your community, and that's maybe why ex-Mormons are looking for the community just to fill that gap in a way. Like, yeah. Well, I'm curious then. So if there's, like, is there, how can we get a sense of what's going on in terms of psychedelics in Utah? We got first person accounts. Is there any data? Miriam, as a researcher, do you know, is there data on what, how many people are taking psychedelics in Utah? What kind of psychedelics people are taking, in what context, on their own, with friends, in churches? Um, yeah, do people know?
Well, I don't know how much research there is on this, and I can't speak to the numbers or statistics. Maybe someone else can in the group. But what I will say is that there are more popular substances that are being used. I would say psilocybin is a really big one, especially microdosing. I even know of Mormon groups that work with microdosing with psilocybin and I feel like ketamine is also a big one. Ketamine is very similar to other things on the market. It's legal, so that there isn't the word of wisdom doesn't necessarily apply to ketamine.
Right.
And so I think, a lot of there's more ketamine clinics now. I mean, it's just shocking. There's a lot of ketamine use here.
Oh,
Yeah, so that's what I can contribute. I wonder if someone else, Doug, you unmuted, so I wonder if you had some more information on that.
Oh, I no, sorry, I didn't mean to unmute because I'm full of data. I guess anecdotally, like without any sort of like actual hard data, just from observation and based on the podcasts that I'm a part of, there is a higher concentration per capita of real specifically Utah-based Mormons getting involved in some of these substances. Yeah, but I got nothing to back that up, so I hardly even dare say that
mm.
as a yeah.
S- Stephanie, what's your kind of personal anecdotal experience? What kind, how are people taking psychedelics? The people who are taking them, what are they taking?
Yeah, I mean, I second what Miriam was saying. There's a lot of psilocybin, a lot of microdosing, a lot of ketamine clinics. There is a church here, and the name is blanking now, where they serve peyote. You guys know what I'm talking about? It's I can't the name is, but that's less common. You like have to be a member. It's harder to, they take it a lot more seriously. So I would say most people are doing yeah, like ketamine and psilocybin. And I did want to comment on what Wesley was saying, if that's okay.
Sure.
Your question earlier about Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, I just wanted to chime in really quick on that. Like, to Wesley's point, I think that even if your family, when you leave Mormonism, it's almost like a death because there's a level of depth that you are meeting people in Mormonism, or it's like your own type of like spiritual connection and emotional connection, whatever, that's like based in this similarity, in this similar belief. And then when you leave, it's like even if they support you or love you, um, there's like it's like a disconnect. There's like a level of attunement that can no longer be reached because it's like you feel like you're trying to reach someone and you can't reach them anymore. Like they can't see you anymore in the same way. And so it for me, it very much felt like a grieving process, going through like a death. And I think for all of us, on this panel, and probably, Wesley as well, the culture we grew up in was very different than how it is now. The Mormon church is there's a lot of PR going on. They're trying not to lose members. They're trying to like, make things appear, whatever. So like they have loosened their grip significantly over time. And it's the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. I would say that is pretty common especially for that area of Utah. But back in the 90s, 80s, like no way, no way in hell would any of us been have been getting away with any of that.
Mm. Because I guess it's changed then through the internet, through social media. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the churches. There have been it seems like a few kind of maybe several psychedelic churches have appeared. There's Singularism, there's the Divine Assembly. I'm sure there's some others as well. Can anyone give us a little bit of an insight into the kind of some of these psychedelic churches that are appearing in Utah? Are they Mormon influenced? Are they anti-Mormon? Has anyone been to any of these churches to start off with? Anyone have any personal experience of
I,
them?
I have a couple of comments. One is I've been to one that, and I think it's really cool what they're doing, providing this religious, or this religious protection for people that may want to do it. And I think that's really amazing. The few times that I went, it didn't really necessarily feel oriented in a positive place. And similarly, there was a huge summit, the psychedelic summit. Paul Stamets came and spoke to us in Salt Lake, and I couldn't help but noticing like half of the conference was bashing Mormons and bashing religion. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, guys, like, what? How is this any better than maybe you know operating in a church and having these things if we're going to be bashing? And so I feel like to me, this is why people really struggle. There's not really an orientation in a particular direction. You have this experience, you get completely disoriented, and then you don't know like where to go. And I personally haven't seen necessarily like a great organization that's really helping people in their faith crisis if they decide to leave, to sort of kind of at least point them like in an upward direction, including the ketamine clinics, which often don't have like proper integration and stuff after the fact to help somebody actually digest. And it's similar to AI is so disruptive and powerful. We don't know what it's going to do to our whole economy. I feel this is very similar, that we have people getting disoriented, and it's such a powerful natural tool at our disposal. And I don't know if that's what I'm nervous about. That's what nobody really understands that well. And I think we're all just trying our best to figure out how to
Mm.
integrate it.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess there's 2 points there. One is this just psychedelics as disruptive, a new disruptive technology like AI, and trying to integrate it. The other point you made, Rich, is that you felt the psychedelic church was a little bit defining itself against Mormonism, anti-Mormon, perhaps not so much giving a kind of positive theology, its own independent identity. Has anyone else on the panel or indeed in the audience been to a psychedelic church in Utah and got any thoughts on it? Wesley?
Yeah, I'm still a card-carrying member of the Divine Assembly. I have it somewhere in my wallet. It makes for a good cocktail hour up here in Park City. But I went every Sunday or Saturday, whatever day it was, I can't remember now, for about a year. And it's weird. it lost its attraction to me. And I don't know if it's because I've just become cynical after leaving the Mormon church. I'm kind of, I don't want to belong to any group. But just, riffing off of what Richard said, and nice to meet you, Richard, by the way, and Stephanie. Um, I found it to have a real it's weird. It wasn't intentionally anti-Mormon, but almost everyone there were recovering Mormons, and so they were trying to process not just the trauma associated with them leaving the church, but also trying to find a new community. And so a lot of the conversation, almost all of the conversation, was centered. They were identifying themselves as people who had left this church and had been harmed by it, and they were trying to find community. And so I mentioned this to Steve once, the founder of the church. I said, if I was an active member and came to this, I was curious about it, I wouldn't stay because I wouldn't feel welcome. And it was interesting to me in the context of taking psychedelics because, Stephanie, you had mentioned that when you leave the church, the members who stay active can't see you any longer. I would also say that we have a hard time seeing them. And, I would hope that psychedelics would help that because they've actually helped since I left the church. I've been very I've been nice and civil to everyone in my family, but I've always been kind of judgy whenever they would say a prayer at a family meeting or reunion. And I was always kind of in the back of my mind thinking, I'm better because you guys don't know. And I know. But after taking psychedelics in the last few years, I've been able to really celebrate their faith in a way that I haven't. And I would like to see a psychedelic church that's got a bunch of former Mormons in it that would also celebrate that in a way to where a Mormon could come and they could go, oh yeah, this is chill, this is okay. They've got their issues with Mormonism, that's why they left, but it's okay. And they wouldn't feel like somehow they were on the wrong side of history, so to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
Amen, Wesley.
That sounds good. Thank you. So
Jules, could I jump in here
yes,
on
Doug.
this?
Yeah, and David, I
I
see your
just
hand raised as well. Yeah.
oh, I
No, go for it,
I
Doug.
don't okay. I just want to kind of represent um there's some great questions in the chat over here.
Mm,
I'm going to say Vadim maybe is asking about um, what the church does about members sharing their mystical experiences and discussing those. And then what does that look like when people leave the church? First of all, the church enthusiastically encourages its members to share publicly their mystical experiences. Um, Not only is, Wes had mentioned that it's a lay priesthood as far as like it's volunteer priesthood, but everyone has a role and teaches and shares their uh, testimony and their faith and their spiritual experiences on a weekly basis. And then to the point where the every church in every neighborhood does a monthly open mic day on Sunday where it's like, people, please come up to this pulpit and share with us how you gained your testimony and what things have happened to make you believe that and what kind of like interactions with heavenly beings that you've had. The problem is those have to be church affirming experiences or they're not welcome. And so that leads to this sense of um, really hiding anything that happens that is not church affirming. I think, people have probably heard about some of the controversies around uh, uh, interviews that bishops do and other ecclesiastical leaders within the Mormon Church. They ask questions on a one-on-one basis about your masturbation habits or what kind of swear words you've said or what kind of alcohol you've consumed. And so you learn uh, that it's important to share the things that matter to you that also affirm the church and hide the things that matter to you that do not affirm the church. And
mhm.
so then there's this really weird break. Stephanie was talking about that death that happens. There's this really strange break that happens after you go through that whole grieving process. And I don't know that after is the right word because I'm still going through that grieving process. But then what remains is a desire to still share those mystical experiences. This is why I'm sitting on this panel. It's why I have a fucking podcast called Mormons on Mushrooms. Like it's there's that desire to share with the people that I care about or with the people that I love cool things that are happening. Cool. I'm sorry about the swear words. I'm not sure what kind of cuss words are allowed on this particular panel. But and then to the point that everyone was making, I know Wes made a really good point. In the chat, they're talking about not joining anything. I'm a member of the Divine Assembly. I really like being a member of things. I'm missing that sense of community since leaving Mormon Church. I seek out tribe. I seek out like-minded people. I don't consider the Divine Assembly to be uh, divinely led. I don't consider them to be a source of truth for me. They do offer uh, uh, protections, constitutional protections for what I consider to be sacred sacrament. Um, Same way I'm a member of Costco that gives me access to great hot dogs and drink deal at Costco for $1.50. Um, I seek out community. I just don't seek out community that wants to do the thinking for me or to tell me what to do or how to do it. I think that's a really important distinction that happens along the way during, as Stephanie so eloquently put it, during that death and rebirth and grieving process. So I
Okay.
just wanted to, I know I kind of steered us a little bit away from what your question was, but the chat was
No, no,
starting to pile up
thank
and
you,
I
Doc.
love
It's
paying
very
attention to the
helpful.
chat.
Very
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I've got a horrible feeling we're about to have loads of people join this Zoom because they because the Eventbrite sent out a different time or something. But let's see what happens. David, a quick comment or question from you?
Just the quick comment I wanted to throw out there was I'm just from an outsider's perspective, I'm seeing a lot of parallels that I almost like to see a panel sometime or a conclave between ex-Mormons engaged with psychedelics and ex-Orthodox Jews engaged in psychedelics because the parallel is that when you're part of the system, it's totalizing. It's not just faith or religion, it's family, it's work, it's your social relations. And then similarly, when you leave or you engage in psychedelics, there's a spectrum where some people are rejecting their old way of life and they're embracing something new. Other people want to remain in some respect. They either want to figure out how psychedelics actually work into the framework that they already had, or how they're going to renegotiate that relationship, or they might be out, but they still want to feel connected. It's a very similar dynamic, and I'm just finally struck by the challenge. You hear so much in the psychedelic community about having a safe container for integration. And one of the things that, like, we'll call them illiberal communities, communities that are not necessarily based on individual autonomy, one of the things they do actually succeed in doing is creating these, containers of connection and networks and everything else. And so it's just this terrible tension and a trade-off where when you leave them and you engage in psychedelics, you're suddenly cast out and have to try to recreate that sort of environment. And I don't know that I've got an answer. I'm struck by the parallels between the two communities.
Yeah, for sure. That'd be fascinating. I'm going to a psychedelics and religion conference in Harvard in April, and I know there's panelists talking about ayahuasca use in Orthodox Jewish, circles in New York and in Israel. Um, yeah, and I know there is a research team looking at psychedelics in different religious contexts, including Mormonism. I think Noah, who's in the audience, maybe might be working on that. I see people joining now. I think we're gonna have to start again from the beginning. Um, that's Eventbrite. I'm sorry if people join thinking this that we're actually an hour in, but we've got some time left and we've got plenty to discuss. So hello to the people who recently joined. I want to talk about safety and ethics in the Utah psychedelic scene. I find this fascinating as well. I mean, like, for context, I'm conscious that um, there is in the kind of alternative therapy and wellness scene in Utah, there have sometimes been issues of harm, of kind of life coaches, behaving badly. Utah is famously the only state with a law about how, life coaches not representing themselves as therapists or something like that. It's also like the fraud capital of the US, interestingly, kind of with multi-level marketing schemes. And so let's just talk a bit about that, about the risks of harm or bad actors or unintentional harm in the kind of psychedelic culture in Utah. Rich, we got in touch because I've been looking at a story of a particular life coach who caused a fair amount of harm in Utah with multiple people, including Rich. It's a long story, Rich, but could you give us just a kind of taste of what of your experience and maybe your takeaways? And obviously, I'm going to ask you just to encapsulate that in a few minutes, which is it's just a challenge, I know.
Yeah, yeah, to keep it real brief. I mean, I feel like if you're a financial advisor, you have a fiduciary responsibility to do what's right by your client, especially, you're dealing with an older person. You don't throw them in a risky investment. And I feel the same way in a religious setting, you have this responsibility. And what's happening is there's a lot of people that end up helping facilitate these experiences. And instead of necessarily taking it with reverence and humility, it becomes a control mechanism, an inflation of their own power structure, their own ego. And in my case, you hear a lot of stories, usually with a lot of times the men, there's, sexual assault and weird things that can go down in these scenes because it's a very vulnerable situation. My case was with a female, and more of the threat there was this manipulation. And I really just saw this crazy kind of manipulation of this group that sort of followed her. And what happened is, sort of like you say, you leave her, to me, we need to have our own personal relationship with God. If we are not sovereign, there can't be a clergy, a guru, or anyone between me and God. That's at least how I subscribe spiritually. But what often people do is they want to go into the same pattern of having somebody telling them what to do, and they go find a guru and people call themselves shaman overnight, and they're facilitating these experiences, and then they just sort of reestablish this mini religion again. And just like often happens in religion, it's somebody that might not treat that as delicately and reverently as they should. And I think it's a major, it's again, I think it's like, how do we implement and integrate this technology? It's not like you can even, I mean, on our panel here we have probably the people with the most academic credibility that you can have, but this is more like there's another dimension of this that is really hard to even talk about, much less kind of manage.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's now a kind of court case, actually. This was a life coach who worked with psychedelics, and basically, repeatedly, she targeted wealthy ex-Mormon businessmen, gave them a lot of psychedelics, would try to kind of infiltrate herself into their family life, and then try to get them to leave their wives and be with her, or also hand over some of their businesses to her. And she did this kind of bad behavior repeatedly, and people would wake up to it, and then she denounced them and then find other people as well. So it's quite a wild story, but it's not the only story. There are others, and does the panel? I mean, I'm curious as well. There was a really tragic case of a kind of prominent figure in the Utah psychedelic scene who I believe ran a ketamine clinic, and ended up taking his own life and shooting his son. It's very sad. Can anyone tell us a bit about what happened there? Um, Miriam, is that? Yeah.
Yeah, it was really tragic and shook the community so much because he was a very respectable member of the community who was running a ketamine clinic, and come to find out he was sexually assaulting a lot of women. And this sort of assault, I think, happens a lot in these spaces when a psychedelic can bring you into a very vulnerable and open state and more connective. And I think that This isn't just a risk in the Mormon faith, but in anywhere. Like I think this is a human issue that we're facing, which is that if someone hasn't done their work, and if someone has this like desire to be, the guru, the one with power, there can be a lot more harm that's done in these spaces. And I do see that, especially in this community, that when people are coming out of the church, there's like almost a hole that they're trying to fill. And if they go into a space with someone that claims to know, and they've just come from a space where they were leaving someone or a church that knew, right? And this person claims, this facilitator, this guru, this shaman claims to know what's better for them than they know, then they can just almost go from one extreme to the next, without actually being able to find their own voice. And I think that that's what the value of these medicines can be, is that they allow for people to really listen to themselves, but that can be blocked, and that neuroplasticity can be used for negative ways, especially by facilitators who don't have their own work done, who haven't spent the time really understanding this work and how to allow for people in these spaces to listen to themselves and find their own internal compass and medicine, instead of it being, a leader or another dogma that they jump into.
Yeah, thank you. Any other panelists want to just talk about, this, about, concerns about any kind of harms that are occurring, or how the Utah psychedelic culture can reduce those harms?
I can chime in.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, going back to what we were saying earlier about, and I apologize for my voice, I'm recovering from a cold. But what we were saying earlier about how there's sort of this entrepreneurial mindset inside of Mormonism, I think that can kind of carry over into the psychedelic space where they leave Mormonism and then they're just kind of like, we can do this however we want and we can do whatever we want and we can like find our own way, which can in some ways be good and helpful, but in other ways, it can lead to a lack of safety and a lack of groundedness in the practice and however they're practicing. And then going along with that, it's like if you grew up in a cult, like that way of thinking is in you. Whether you leave and then become someone who is susceptible to another cult, or you kind of swing to more of the narcissistic side of it, where, because in Mormonism as well, there's a lot of like, being told how special you are, being told that you're the one true chosen church, whatever. So they can swing the opposite way as well and then become the gurus themselves or the cult leaders themselves because they haven't really deconstructed those patterns in themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the things that fascinates me about Mormon theology is the idea that every Mormon is going to become a god, and maybe have their own planet. And I'm curious, do you think that can sometimes lead to this psychedelic theology of self-divination, like kind of Brian, what's he called? Brian Johnson. He's kind of he's ex-Mormon, isn't he? And he thinks he's going to become a kind of immortal god, using technology. But so I just, again, am I just wildly off and speculating, or do you think that that Mormon theology could lead into this idea? Well, yeah, we're all going to become gods, or could that sometimes, if you mix that with psychedelics, lead to a kind of tendency to messiah complex?
Yes. So I think that that's a pretty big question, and so it requires a pretty big answer. I'm not going to attempt to address everything. Uh, by nature, I think we humans like to lean into the concept of the one. We let our the hero's journey. I mean, Joseph Campbell, Neo from the Matrix, Luke Skywalker. We like the idea, Harry Potter, the Hunger Games. Like we like the idea of no one quite understands me, but I am very special and unique, and there's a plan for me, and I've got something deep inside that's a spark, and I might be the one. And Mormonism augments that. It leans into that. It says you are the one. Jules, what you're referencing is, as man is, God once was, and as God is, man can someday become. That's literal. That's Mormon doctrine.
Mm.
And by the way, thank you for like reminding me that I have some scriptures memorized still. But the point being, yes, it's very harm reduction in this space is has got to be top priority because the Messiah complex is alive and well in every human being. And then when it's under a microscope in a high demand religion like Mormonism, suddenly, without maybe even knowing it or without even seeking it, someone becomes an authority on something and people seek them out and they want to learn how to do it and they want to know how to do it. But then also you're in these states of altered consciousness that uh, that can be very suggestive or can make you sort of feel a little bit topsy-turvy and upside down, and you don't know where you fit and where you're at in space and time. And uh, both intentional and unintentional predatory behavior can become a result of that. And so it's really important um, to not reject the type of folks who have gone through the academic training of how to interact with human trauma, with how to interact with the human psyche, how to ask those questions and how to be there. Doing mushrooms a couple of times and then deciding that you're going to become a facilitator or a shaman or a guru is not enough of a thing because there's a lot of stuff, whether we want to admit it or not, whether we're aware of it or not, whether it's shadow work, there's a lot of stuff that is deep down inside of us that is that informs how we react to certain situations. It informs how we react to trauma. And if people are not ready for that, suddenly they can enter into unknowingly and unwittingly into an abusive relationship from both sides, and that happens a lot in the psychedelic community, in the ex-Mormon psychedelic community, and beyond.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
by the way, I said that that requires a big answer. I've got like 45 more minutes worth of answer, but that's as much as I can give right now.
Thank you. Scott in the comments says, I've experienced some disturbing examples. Mormons who have represented themselves as life coaches for LGBTQIA plus members and their families. These life coaches represent their positions of leadership in the church or those of their spouse as a way to direct authority for topics where the church is severely lacking. They then use it as an opportunity to make money and assert traditional power like they're running some kind of LLM. They are dangerous people who may have some resemblance of good intention, but they have no training in trauma or suicidal ideation. Miriam, I'm going to ask you about. Rich, do you have something you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to say I love his comment, and I've seen that too. And that's the thing I feel like if people would just pay attention to most in every setting, it doesn't even matter where it is, even in a political setting, the difference between a politician and a statesman is one wants power, one loves their country. In a spiritual setting, there's a difference between, somebody that's actually doing this out of love and someone that may be doing this out of control. And if we aren't discerning of that, I think it's going to just continue to create problems for us.
Do you think ex-Mormons have an underdeveloped bullshit detector?
I think we're
Or
all
is that
pretty
human?
naive.
Or is it not? It's not
Yes.
actually any
I
different.
think humans think they have good bullshit detectors and they are very wrong. I think humans
Yeah.
are very susceptible to bullshit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The
Well,
only sin is ignorance. We're all, unfortunately, we assume the best, especially in those settings. And that's what I'm saying. Like, these people don't, it's really scary actually. And if you are a predatory person, you tend to gravitate to the top of a giant institution or to the top of a control structure. So sadly, there actually is sort of a gravitational pull for the wrong people to step into that position.
what
Mm.
could in 5 or 10 years, let's say that psychedelics is going to continue to grow in Utah. Miriam, I'm going to ask you about the legislation that's hopefully being passed this week in a moment. In 10 years' time, what would a more mature psychedelic culture look like in Utah? What kind of harm reduction or support might be in place, in 10 years that isn't in place now? What are your thoughts, Miriam? What would you like to see in 10 years' time?
Yeah. Well, I feel like right now, as a society, we need a lot more data about what's going on. We can have a lot of anecdotal stories, but doing research, not just clinical research, but qualitative research, ethnographic research, like understanding what's being done and how it's being done and how people are responding from different, demographics or different cultural or religious backgrounds. I think it's really important for us as a society before we start just bringing, accessibility to our front doorsteps, like that we really do need to slow down this process. I find that people get excited about this, and there's almost an urgency to use psychedelics because so many people are suffering and struggling. And so there's this tendency to go too soon, too fast, too much. And that can be really destabilizing on an individual level, but collectively, I feel like before we are able to really use these substances to their full potential, there's a lot of maturing that we need to have in order to slow down this process, be observant about when it's working, when it's not, why it's working, why it's not, so that we can make more informed decisions. So I feel like in 10 years from now, I'm hoping that we have a lot more data, a lot more research, a lot more understanding, and a lot more maturity so that we're able to learn not only about how this works here, but also indigenously. How have these substances been used all over the world so that we can build a better relationship with these substances to use them for their potential?
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the panel about, what you'd like to see, psychedelic culture in Utah look like in 10 years? No, that's okay. That's fine. In which case, I'm going to ask you, Miriam, about the legislation that might be being passed hopefully this week. What is hopefully going to be passed?
Okay, well, I'm so excited to talk about this. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, so my colleague Anya and I really wanted to see the state be more supportive of research around psychedelic use, and so we have been pushing this bill. It's HB 390, and the bill basically allows for the state of Utah to support a clinical trial through the University of Utah's Huntsman Mental Health Institute for them to be able to give psychedelic treatment to veterans with treatment-resistant PTSD. And the specific treatment would be working with 5-MeO DMT, which is a really powerful, very short acting psychedelic. And we would be doing titration, which would allow for there to be a slow movement into a deep altered state instead of just taking a large dose at first. And that feels a lot more trauma informed when we're working with vulnerable populations, especially with PTSD. But it's been incredible to see how much support has been given to this bill. Right now, tomorrow, in fact, we're going to be meeting with the governor who will be signing this bill into law. And what's exciting is that the church didn't push back and that it was almost unanimous through the Senate and the House. There were two members of the House of Representatives that didn't vote yes, but every other legislator voted yes for this, which really to me signals that there is innovation here in Utah and that even with the strong LDS hold and belief system around psychedelics, I think that there's openness here. And I think that openness is because the way that we're doing this is not out of rebellion. We're not trying to get everyone stoned or whatever, but we're trying to bring in responsible care and explore these treatments that might potentially benefit the veterans and the larger community.
Oh, fantastic. Well done. Thank you. I think Anya is actually here as well in the audience. So if psychedelic medicines get approved by the FDA or even maybe approved at the state level, they would no longer conflict with Mormon dogma. Is that correct? I mean, that ketamine is not seen to conflict with Mormon dogma?
Yeah, if they become legal, I believe that a lot more LDS people would be ready and excited to be, using them. especially, I mean, and there's a difference between recreational use, right, and therapeutic use. And I think that there are a lot of people that are looking to these substances for their therapeutic value. And so if it was pitched like that, not necessarily like, all right, everyone can go to a rave, we can be careful with the way that we're going about this. I think that there will be a lot more buy-in from the political realm, but as and also the LDS faith.
Thank you. So Andy in the chat says the same happens slowly with medicinal marijuana. It's okay for LDS members to use with a doctor's note. Um, okay. Are there any questions or comments from the audience? If you can either ask the panel a question, or if you want to speak briefly about your own experience of psychedelics in Utah, or within or outside the LDS Church, you're welcome to do that as well. Keep it brief is all I would say. So if so, stick your hand up digitally. While I'm giving people the opportunity to
Let
gather
me
their...
let me make a comment, Jules.
Yes, Rich.
For me, when I had like an experience like 10 years ago down in Argentina, and then when I was trying to then kind of make sense of it, my girlfriend at the time was taking me to these certain drum circles and things like that. And it was like I think it was Doug or someone was talking about that, or Wesley talking about earlier. I felt like because there's a lot that you learn in the Mormon faith. It's amazing, and it's love. And if you try to deviate, if you try to throw that out the window, that's not going to be very comfortable. But I went to the space, and I sort of noticed there was sort of this nothing matters kind of thing, which is what I call New Age spiritualism. It's sort of a bypass of actually what Miriam was talking about, like the work that one would need to do to make sure they're necessarily orienting properly. So to me, I feel like there's not, this is what I'm saying, there's not really like a soft landing a lot of times for people because to me, I felt like the guys in the community, these things I was going to were trying to find a clever way to, climb, good status with women. And it didn't really feel like a spiritually, positive place. So that was just my experience. So integrating, I couldn't really, it just made integration much more difficult.
Yeah, thank you. Noah asks, are there any good integration circles anyone leads or knows of? Local integration support in Utah? Anyone come across any?
I don't know of any group work, but I do know that there are lots more integration coaches that do this work, and also more and more therapists who are willing to kind of work with somebody through a psychedelic experience. So, and then actually with group work, I know that there are art integration circles that are coming up, which are really profound and poignant. So, and I know that the Divine Assembly also they do have regular meetings where they're informal that can be useful for integration.
Yeah, thank you. Yes,
I can
definitely.
Oh,
Sorry, I'll just add real quick. The only person that came to mind was Christian Snuffer. If anybody follows him, he's a ketamine therapist. I feel like he does circles, and I think he might do group work online. And he's really good with like body awareness and somatic stuff. So that's somebody that I usually recommend.
Thank you. Great. Any other questions? One I have while people are thinking is, does the panel think there is any chance of the Mormon Church accepting psychedelics, even as part of worship, or is that, I think there was someone in the history of Mormonism who tried that with peyote. Frederick Smith, I think it was, like in the 19th century. But any chance of that, that there's a space within Mormonism for people's psychedelic spiritual experiences, that it leads to maybe even some kind of, people coming back to Mormonism, or is that unlikely? What are the panel's thoughts?
I'll just jump in here and say I mean, institutionally, I think that's a long that's a long shot, and my gut would say there would have to be some pretty revolutionary movements within Mormonism for that to occur.
Right.
Mormonism does tout itself as being an ever-changing faith because there's active communication with God and active leadership that leads the church. The claim is that there's active leadership that leads the church, just the same way that prophets have led different iterations of the church in the past. But all that said, um, that's pretty out there for the power structures that exist and the way that those power structures exist institutionally lend themselves to basically octogenarians being in charge. Like it's like it's a pretty exclusive club and it's men only as far as like the top brass of the church.
Right.
And when you're talking about 60, 70, 80, 90, 100-year-old white men, uh, that takes a long way. That takes a long time for that to sort of like work itself through the chart. And so I guess my answer, the panel might think differently, but my answer is no, that's probably not on the horizon.
So in terms of kind of gender dynamics, um, it sounds like Mormonism then sounds quite patriarchal and male dominated.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Psychedelic culture in Utah, does it reflect that or completely subvert it? Is it also very patriarchal, psychedelic culture in Utah, or is it react very strongly against it? It's even more, more kind of female-led, or what? How does that interact, psychedelic culture, with that?
I'd like to speak with the group work that I've seen in Utah. When there is a facilitator, oftentimes I've seen the majority of the women, or the majority of the group being women. I don't know how others feel about this, but that it feels like for a lot of Mormon women that have left the church, that they're able to find that sense of community and it's been female led. And so I know that there are pockets of female led groups. And I think that that is really important, especially as people coming out of a very patriarchal system to have more of a matriarchal system or more of a female led orientation. And I know that there's hunger for that. I don't know how much it's actualized in all of the groups, but the groups that I've seen have been highly female.
Mm.
That's been similar to my experience as well. I feel like in Mormonism, there's this, they talk about Heavenly Mother. There's like they don't talk about her a lot, but it's like this whispering, like she's there and whatever. And I think a lot of Mormon women are very curious about like that. And that kind of like trickles over, it's like they want to embrace, um, they don't want to be under the patriarchy anymore. They want to embrace their power as women and all that that entails. And in my experience, it's been pretty positive. I feel like those women-led groups and circles and whatnot, it's been a pretty positive, empowering experience.
Yeah. I mean, Rich, you obviously, you had a kind of less positive experience with a kind of culty, predatory female life coach. And do you think the fact that it was a woman was just made it kind of harder to spot the kind of predatory dynamics?
To- Totally. I mean, to me, I would like if you had a disagreement with another male, growing up, you might, fight it out, get punched in the face, and then, you work it out after. To me, I was so oblivious to the manipulation dimension because it doesn't like if I wanted to be violent with somebody, it would be by nature. I'm just saying physically, it would be a physical altercation. I really wasn't aware of this kind of manipulative jujitsu that was going on. And so it's because I wasn't aware of it, caught me by surprise. And to Wesley's comment in the chat, I feel like women are actually better equipped naturally. The feminine anyway is better equipped naturally to create, expand, and new spaces, whereas the masculine were generally more orderly and structured. And yeah, it totally caught me by surprise in my settings. I was very naive.
Mm. I mean, she wasn't a ex-LDS herself, but she would try to get clients to leave leave their wives, saying, "Oh, the wives are so submissive," and this kind of thing. And so yeah, there was almost like an invasive species that the ex-Mormons just weren't programmed to kind of spot, as a threat. Um, okay, any other? We're coming to the end. Very sorry for people who came late. I guess maybe Eventbrite. I figure maybe set a different time. Yeah, everyone will get the recording. Um, we had a great first hour. Covered some great topics. Scott, you've got it looks like a question or a comment.
Yeah, if I may, just take a
Sure.
minute.
Yes.
I appreciate the panel doing this, and I think there's a huge need for it. And finding something that could help me through my own psilocybin experience. 3 years ago, it was a matter of going to friends, scavenging the internet, trying to find people who I might be able to trust, coming out of a religion where suddenly you feel like nobody's trustworthy. It's a huge process. And so being able to talk to like-minded individuals who have gone through something similar is really important. And I think that being able to also identify what Miriam was saying, where things are suddenly legal, and you're putting yourself up against so many different kinds of scenarios of what happens if I have to go to the hospital, what happens if anything goes wrong. So I just the complexity of doing something like this, I don't want to under I don't want to I want to try and help you understand that for me this was the scariest experience of my life, but it was also the biggest life changing experience of my entire life, and it continues to be, and it's something that I'm still integrating 3 years later, that initial one experience with an individual therapist. And it would be great if I could find some group therapists that could also help me with that in that kind of setting. But this is a long process. It's a it's been an amazing journey. It's been a beautiful journey, but I think that hearing from other people, they're just talking about, oh yeah, I've gotten into these other life coaches, and I've or these other people who seemingly have had answers that I'm lacking. Well, as a gay man, I've been through reparative therapies that have been represented by Mormons, by people who are in authority, by LDS social services. And you might have a better appreciation now for what we've all been through and trying to find a way through this, through the church. It's impossible. And people are just there as vultures to take advantage of that, unfortunately. And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there. I think I hate that I even know this, but just even hearing you talk about how Mormons believe that that will be gods and that will have planets. Well, they're backtracking from that too now. The apologists have now kind of backtracked from that as well. So even knowing what this Mormonism is all about, when you're talking about the 80s, 90s, and now, it who knows what it is anymore? It's anybody's guess. So it's just confusing, and it's been manufactured to be confusing, in my opinion.
Mm.
But thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you too. We've still got people joining the group now. I don't know if I could have to stay on this Zoom and welcome people for the next hour or so. But unfortunately, to the person who just joined, we're actually wrapping up now. But I want to thank the panel and give the panel an opportunity for any kind of last thoughts. Um, Stephanie, I'll start with you. Any final reflections?
I mean, I just want to offer like my solidarity, for anybody out there that is going through the deconstruction process or who maybe had like a difficult psychedelic experience they're trying to integrate or both. Um, I kind of fall into the category of like when you're going through the deconstruction process, like everything is welcome, meaning like I had to be angry, I had to be bitter, I had to be confused, I had to be whatever, and to just like allow myself to go through that process and not try to like make myself feel something that I wasn't feeling, to just really be honest with myself about how difficult it was and the support that I needed and the support that I wasn't getting and whatnot. So I just want to like offer my solidarity, because the process for me was incredibly difficult and destabilizing. It was, I think it can be hard when you feel like you're the only one who is experiencing it that way, So I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you. And I did an interview with Stephanie actually. She was kind enough to share kind of stories of recovery about a challenging psychedelic experience and what helped her recover. So I'll put that in the chat. Doug, how about you? Any final reflections?
Just really, this discussion, I think, is a really cool discussion. You, Jules, had asked about what does the world of psychedelics look like in 5 or 10 years? I've just been thinking, I've been reflecting a lot about that because it is a pretty tough road. Even legally, it's about safe and affordable access to these types of modalities and substances, and it's really not about a a money-making opportunity for the state or for private businesses. I think Miriam is the one who had talked about indigenous cultures and the way that it's used. I mean, that there really is a patience that is required. And the thing most important for me that I still am kind of hanging on to that I'm trying to let go is that there's someone else who has answers, or there's something else that has answers, and there's not the medicines that we've been talking about, the substances that we've been talking about, the facilitators, the shaman. They don't. There's not a fast track to doing the very hard and long self work of realizing that it's up to me. It's that my life is mine, and that's where I've got to find my answers, and that's where I've got to find my peace. And so, legal or illegal, allowed or disavowed within the church, none of that really matters so much to me as much as that individual journey. There's not a shortcut, and there's not a person out there who can tell you differently, that they know the answer.
Thank you.
Even what I just said is all bullshit. I don't know the answer either.
Okay. I'm going to ask Richard, and Wesley, I'm going to ask you for any kind of last thoughts too, and then Miriam. Richard, any final reflections?
Well, thank you, Jules, for doing this. And I just want to tell everyone that, everything that happens in our life, one of the core axiomatic beliefs I have is that there is divine order in all things. And everything that we experience, every encounter we have, and have every podcast we listen to, it's serving a purpose of evolving consciousness. And if you're stepping into this space and you want some orientation, the body of work that was most meaningful for me was the body of work from David Hawkins. I also love A Course in Miracles, The Law of One. There's a lot of other great books, but for myself to understand that we are operating at variable levels of consciousness, and so what the spiritual work actually means, to Doug's point, um, there's an evolution taking place, and I believe that this has a role. I believe that these medicines, and they're medicine when used in the appropriate context, they're drugs when used in the inappropriate context, but I believe that used well, these can give us windows into higher states of consciousness that we can be at naturally if we do the work that Doug's talking about. And it's a slog, and it's difficult. And I pray for everybody's every night. I pray for the evolution of consciousness, and I pray for everyone on this panel that we can all suffer less and be more loving.
Thank you, Rich. Wesley.
Yeah, two comments. First, I really want to apologize for jumping in. I thought when you sent me the link at 11:30, I thought, oh, well, the forum doesn't start for half an hour. And so when I got on and there were six people on, I thought you guys were just chatting before your panel discussion. So I just jumped in. I just jumped in obnoxiously. So apologies for that. Um, so I'm not on the panel, but I'll comment anyway, as you know me, because I love to talk. I want to riff on what Doug and Miriam said, which I think was is really interesting. We grow up in the church. The biggest value in the church is to know, and the biggest non-value, if you will, or the worst thing in the church is to doubt. And so everything that you learn, and I used to love 5-year-old little kids getting up at sacrament meeting and saying and testifying they knew the church was true, Joseph Smith was a prophet. Rather freaks me out now if I think about it in hindsight. But I thought that was really cool. And so we think we know, we know, we know. Things don't work out for us in the church. We leave the church. We maybe have spiritual experiences while we were in the church, which I did, but then we take psychedelics and we go, oh shit, now I really know, right? Because it's like 10x the intensity of the experiences we had as Mormons. And so we have to make sense of that. And because we were trained that knowing is more important than doubting, we immediately kind of migrate into these more kind of cultish aspects of the medicine where we think that it teaches us all this stuff and that we know all this stuff. So I think that is what turbocharges the former Mormons in psychedelics. And I think that something that would be really healthy, and I know that Miriam's working on this, and so are Doug and Stephanie, is to just say it's okay to not know. It's okay to not know. And if the psychedelics can help you feel comfortable about having incredible experiences, actually, high-fiving God, and then still not knowing that if that were actually God or not, that's okay. That's okay. And that we can go through our whole lives not knowing and that that's okay. That would be a really cool thing that I think that could develop within the culture here in Utah and among former Mormons that take psychedelics and even Mormons for that matter, active Mormons.
Thank you. And by the by, quickly, Wesley is an author who introduced me to some of the panel as well, and is has just been very helpful in my kind of curiosity and understanding about psychedelics in Utah. Miriam, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just really am grateful for these types of conversations. And especially in the Mormon faith, there's a lot of stuff that happens in secret and in your own little room. And I think that that's where the trouble lies, is that we're not able to connect about this in a way that can be meaningful and supportive. So thank you, Jules, for your work. And I think just in closing for me, the human experience is just riddled with mystery and mess and tension and hardship and joy and bliss. And I think that what psychedelics offer is a way for us to really connect to ourselves and understand it better. And so, as we're exploring these, going slow and being patient with this as a developmental process, I think allows for us to breathe around it and to not necessarily have to find anyone, to Doug's point, that is a guru. If anyone's trying to sell you on psychedelics and they want to like charge you, or they think that they're better than you, or no one they understand you, like that is a massive red flag in this space. And this is such a spiritual and private experience that can happen, and also communal. But to know that there are the same levels of greed and corruption and manipulation and all of that that happens in every field of the human, space, it's also happening here. And to be vigilant, to do your work, to make sure that you're protecting yourself, because you don't want to step into something that could be incredibly harmful with people that don't really know what they're doing or don't have your best intention in mind. So being slow, being patient, doing your research, I think can allow for this experience, this unraveling of our consciousness, this exploration to be more of a joyful experience.
Fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed it. I love this topic. I look forward to coming to Utah and learning more. Still, people are arriving. Sorry, Alicia Bigelow. We're just closing. So I want to on the behalf of everybody, I want to thank the panel. Miriam, Rich, Doug, Stephanie, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming as well. Sorry to people who came late. You will get the recording. I'll send that out today or tomorrow. And let's keep the conversation going. There's still so much more to discuss and learn. So thank you, and fingers crossed for Miriam and Anya that the legislation passes this week. We'll be cheering you on. Okay, thank you, everybody.